Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and I would like to begin by saying that this is not a debunking video of Invicta's work. Invicta does excellent research on his documentaries and I have zero animosity towards him. So absolutely go check him out, and if you like what you see, subscribe. This is a response video to deep dive into a topic, the concept of racism, discrimination and racial perception when it comes to population subsets in ancient Rome, which I believe is easily prone to modernism, societal projection and misunderstanding. I am of course aware that this is a 3-year-old video I'm responding to, but I see no updates from him, so I take it that he still holds the information here to be 100% valid. Now, by and large, I agree with him and what he presents for a good 80% of the video, but there are some key elements and fundamental statements that, if I understand them correctly, I strongly disagree with, and I would like to address them here. Not as a way to correct him per se, but to open a debate and trigger new reflections upon these discursive fields in the spirit of discussion and mutual cooperation. Moreover, this is the past of my country we're talking about, so I'd like to see it represented in the best way and most accurate way possible. With that being said, hello Invicta, and let's deep dive. In your otherwise really good video, there are still 3 main items I'd like to cover, which I think either require more expansion or might need to be readdressed entirely. Race and racial perception, where we'll be confronting Roman racial exclusionary practices in the acquisition and analysis of socio-historical data, the Cosmopolitan phenomena in classical urban areas, and finally some points about slavery, which I will be addressing from the perspective of the classical socioeconomic strata.
When we ask, what did the Romans think about race? We're doing so based on our own modern framing of that term. Today, race generally gets equated to one's physical appearance, and in particular, skin color. Humans have always had ways of distinguishing in versus out groups, and it just so happens that our own has its seeds in the 16th to 18th centuries with the age of exploration, the conquest of the New World, and the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. The idea of race we have today is a product of this recent shift.
See, this assertion rests on the assumption that racism based on phenotypic variance is a modern construct. I respectfully beg to differ.
So what came before? Humans have also long had observable physical differences for thousands of years, which our ancestors were certainly not blind to. It's just that in the past, people had to rely on a more broad range of indicators for how to group individuals. Rather than the physical, this ended up being the cultural.
While I agree with the general idea that modern racism is different from ancient racism, I'm adamant that the connections between culture and racist behavior should be laid out through non-modern, culturally invasive inference. In other words, my take on this idea that you propose that racism in ancient Rome was not based on your look, but it was based on your culture, is a form of modernism and therefore ultimately flawed. You do repeat it 3 times on your video, so I feel like that's the core message you want people to take home.
Rather than the physical, this ended up being the cultural. Again, racial ideas were tied more to one's culture rather than one's appearance, with the main takeaway being that race in antiquity was more about culture than appearance.
So, the question is there a causal link between physical appearance and racial discrimination in ancient Rome, particularly when associated with societal trajectories of discriminatory behavior in the sources? Well, the answer is that there absolutely is a documented correlation between physical characteristics, specifically appearance, and discrimination when it comes to social feedback in Rome. Now, certain discrimination patterns have always existed, and this is a conjecture on my part, but I'll go as far as to say that implicit discriminatory beliefs and racial disparities based on your looks, which exacerbated social issues, have existed since prehistoric tribalism. And the phenotypic differences that we perceive as indicators, such as skin pigmentation, hair texture, body composition, sweat gland density, do appear throughout human interaction on a continuum. It is my belief that these indicators still deeply affected the lived experiences of individuals in ancient Rome, even if in a different manner than today. The ancient Romans were indeed a people of sophisticated philosophical paradigms, and surely I agree with you that their discrimination was not uniquely based on people's appearances. But the physical aspect is also part of it. And the other part is not just cultural, but it's rather political, which is the sphere that justifies discriminatory behavior in their minds. And then, after having said this, you proceed to read from Architettura Book 6, a paradox in your thesis, if you will.
This is the reason why the people of the North are so large in stature, so light in complexion, and have straight red hair, blue eyes, and are full of blood. for they are thus formed by the abundance of the moisture and the coldness of their country. Those who live near the equator and are exactly under the sun's course are, owing to its power, low in stature, of dark complexion, with curling hair, black eyes, weak legs, deficient in quantity of blood, and this deficiency of blood makes them timid when opposed in battle.
So, am I saying that this interpretation of the world and its people that we read in Architectura Book 6 is racist the same way as racism was conceived in the 18th century or 19th century? No, of course not. If anything, it's a sort of environmental determinism, so to speak. It does create stereotypes, and it absolutely is based on your physical appearance as well as your mental and cultural ones. This ancient analysis treating the environment as a key factor influencing human condition, mental predisposition and physical appearance emphasizes the fact that the ancient used a type of theoretical methodology which used accessible environmental data as a quantitative information pattern to justify and explain biological transformation in human subgroups and societies. Of course, it's not like the Romans had access to DNA or isotope analysis, but for the purposes of this video it does show that they were absolutely fixated on physical appearances. So the question is, could these studies and theories and ideas be used as a form of discriminatory pattern? Well, you answer that when you quote Vitruvius. It is, however, very difficult to defend a solid demarcation between cultural racism and physical racism when you read the sources. There is also a very famous incident when it comes to Emperor Septimus Severus and his negative reaction when he saw an Ethiopian soldier or auxiliary soldier. Let's read it. And when Severus, in a rage, ordered that the man be removed from his sight, troubled as he was by the man's ominous color and the ominous nature of the garland. So according to Septimus Severus, whether he was joking or he meant it, black skin was connected to dark omen. And I know that some people try to debunk this one, but it's not the only one we have. We have a similar interaction between Brutus and Cassius as they march to fight Octavianus and Antoninus at Philippi. We read, "When the soldiers were going out to a fight, an Ethiopian met them in front of the gates, and they considered this a bad omen. They immediately cut him in pieces." Yeah, not racist at all. No. I mean, if that's not racist and physically racist, I don't know what is. We also read, "An Ethiopian who met the troops as they were marching to battle was only too clearly an omen of disaster." So at least some Romans perceived certain phenotypic types to be a bad omen. They don't like the Nordic type, they don't like the Ethiopians. Still, in response to those that say, oh no, but Septimus Severus doesn't count, okay, well, we have another story. In Historia Augusta, Septimus Severus is annoyed because in Luguallum, the city priest presents him with black sacrificial animals in response to his request to honor the gods with sacrifices. All of this is clear evidence that phenotypic traits were constantly noted and utilized by the Romans throughout their sources. On your video, you strive to discuss the differences between the modern usage of the word race, racism, and the ancient usage of it. Fair.
When we ask, what did the Romans think about race? We're doing so based on our own modern framing of that term. So what came before?
I reckon, however, that it's important to also spend the same amount of time and effort into explaining the fundamental difference between the modern meaning of the word cosmopolitan, which you do use to describe more than one classical city.
We know, for instance, how a cosmopolitan Rome bustled with people from across the known world,
And the ancient meaning of this word, particularly when contextualized in period. Just like the racial aspect, this is a key element of distinction when addressing Rome and modern society in a comparative key as you are. Let's discuss what it meant to be cosmopolitan in ancient Rome at an ontological level. Politics, society and culture will act as a foil for this argumentation. Modernly, cosmopolitan has a dual meaning. In a looser sense, the modern way in which we understand the word when used in reference to a town is that said city contains a wide range of people from different countries, cultural backgrounds, religions, etc. I like Paris, I find a job in Paris, I'm not French, I moved to Paris, lots of other people do that for variable reasons. Paris is a cosmopolitan city. However, in a broader sense, modern philosophical theories of cosmopolitanism focus on the uniting features defining the world as a shared homeland for all mankind, hence expanding into the realm of equal rights together with the capacity to live with the element other. Note that in the modern sense there is usually an element of choice when it comes to the migrants in conjunction with governmental foreign policies. The Roman Empire instead is a political entity that conquered, expanded and incorporated by military suppression. More concretely, Rome had subdued large parts of the known world, forcing the inhabitants of the conquered regions to serve Rome, as you mentioned, paying taxes and accept Roman state cults. Rome was imperialistic, which is a clear-cut opposite to modern cosmopolitanism. This is why I think it's important when we use the word cosmopolitan to describe cities in the classical period that we also underline the fact that an imperialistic society is riddled with inequality, and it's characterized by the dominion of an elite minority exploiting the subdued masses. Consequently, from this perspective, the Imperium Romanum was not cosmopolitan at all. And yet I can also agree with you in the sense that when we look at Roman citizenship, it went from someone inhabiting the same city walls to the universal needs of an ever-expanding empire. Furthermore, we know that cosmopolitan ideologies were pushed by the likes of Cicero, who himself took them from the Greek Stoics. The reality is that in Rome there is an intrinsic societal ambiguity where the authorities construct a dichotomy between cosmopolitanism and imperialism. Hence, the situation has socio-political compounding layers that, when addressed properly, can contribute to the correct interpretation of documented facts. In agreement with Invicta's usage of the term cosmopolitan, Roman society was not purely top-down, it was dynamic. The inhabitants of the provinces adopted Roman identity, but at the same time they kept their own, because Rome was, at the end of the day, relatively tolerant when compared to other empires. The ancient world was indeed culturally and physically interconnected. We know, for instance, the festival calendars were synchronized all over the Mediterranean basin. The Roman Empire and its cities had cosmopolitan elements, but Rome's elite and upper class actively exploited the provinces for personal gain. So yes, Rome or Alexandria were cosmopolitan in a sense, but ancient cosmopolitan discourse must be recontextualized and adapted to classical cosmopolitan frameworks. So, not a major point of disagreement, but just thought I'd add a bit of context to the words used. The sources do show an overall negative perception of alien phenotypic traits. Given, the sources do mostly focus on Nordic types. For example, excessive sweat of the Gauls, the pale white soft flesh. Empirical evidence suggests that Roman judgments moves indiscriminately between physical appearance and cultural aspects when judging and delineating other people and their value. For example, we are told that the Britons are all savages. They paint their body blue, walk around the marshes half naked. And to strengthen this idea of how much the Romans focused on physical appearance, Tacitus distinguishes the inhabitants of Britannia between those who lived in the lowland, the west, and the north, you guessed it, by physical appearance. The Bretons from the lowlands are similar to the Gauls, the northern ones are big and red-headed, so according to him they descend from the Germanic tribes. Those in the west, in particular the Siluri of modern Wales, are a dark complexion with curly hair, so to him, also due to the geographic position near the southwestern shore, they must be racially connected with the Iberians. Not to mention the passage in the Satyricon by Petronius. Check this out. This is a camouflage scene. Petronius writes, "Consider the plan I've discovered. Eumolpus certainly has some ink. Let's change our skin color from hair to nails with this paint in the guise of Ethiopian slaves. We will cheerfully serve you without painful fetters. We will fool our enemies with a change of skin color." Here's another character's reply to this proposal. "Or whiten our faces with chalk, so he thinks that we are citizens of Gaul." And then he ends, as if color alone could hide our looks. So I partially agree with your statement when you say they didn't really care as long as you paid taxes, but I think it's more profound than that, and it enters the political sphere. They don't care what you look like or how you speak as long as you're not hostile to Rome. And the moment that people, whether it be white or whether it be black, becomes militarily hostile to the Romans, they go nuts on the sources and use everything they can to paint these people in the worst light possible, including phenotypic traits. And the negativity perceived from a people that looked different is proportional to the ethnopolitical interaction with the state. So for some people, their racism, which was absolutely connected to both culture and the looks, had as a justification politics rather than genetics. Still racism though. So Roman moral judgment is not uniquely based on physical appearance alone, but on the relation with the people in question.
So yeah, even if this is just a character in a play, you can see where the conversation is headed. Some prejudices here are quite familiar to us. The idea of an immigrant people with a different language, strange music, and odd customs who poison a land that was once great. However, other prejudices seem quite farcical. For example, pants used to be a sign of the barbarian other, and no true Roman would be caught dead without their toga or tunic.
And once again, you say that appearance doesn't matter, and yet you just read that just having trousers could be enough to be discriminated. As a point of agreement with Invicta, I'll give him that at least some people felt the way he describes. For example, there is this incident between Emperor Claudius and the Senate when they are discussing whether or not to allow Gauls from Gallia Comata to enter the inner circle of power, the Senate. And there are many senators that oppose this vehemently. They don't want the Gauls from Gallia Comata to be considered Roman. Claudius responds, "Among my ancestors, the older of which, Clausus of Sabine extraction, he was made citizen completely and head of a patrician family. There I find the encouragement to adopt the same policy in my administration, transferring here all the real excellence wherever it may be." Without looking too far back, members of the Senate were called from Etruria, from Lucania, from all over Italy, and that in the end Italy itself was extended until the Alps, so that not only individuals but countries and nationalities may form a single body under the name Romans. Are we complaining that the Balbi came here from Spain and equally illustrious families from Gallia Narborensis? What else was fatal for Sparta and Athens, regardless of their military might, if not their policy to keep the conquered distant as foreigners? Foreigners have been king among us, so presumably the Volsci and the Equi never did form a battle line against us. He's being sarcastic here. We were taken by the Gauls, but we have also given hostages to the Etruscans, and were under Samnite yoke. Now that customs, culture, and marriage have fused them with us, let them bring among us their gold and their riches instead of keeping them outside the circle. What's very interesting about this incident is not only the fact that, as you can see, Claudius was very open-minded when it came to accepting people into the fold as long as they brought money, gold, and power with them, but that, of course, neither him nor his senatorial detractors ever mentioned phenotypic traits as one of the reasons why the Gauls from Gallia Narborensis shouldn't be allowed in, or the Gauls from Gallia Comata shouldn't be allowed in. No one is saying, well, yeah, but they look like giant mozzarella cheeses and they are extremely pale, whereas the Sabines and the Etruscans looked like us phenotypically. However, it's also possible that someone like Vitruvius would have brought up that as an argument. So it very much depended, kind of like today. Okay, in the section about slaves, I think what you are pretty much bringing forth is the idea that the farms with all the slaves in ancient Rome didn't look anything like the antebellum American farms. In other words, the Romans didn't just have black slaves. I agree with that. I want to say that the majority of slaves in ancient Rome would have very much looked like their masters, in the sense that the Greeks or the ones from modern-day Turkey, yeah, phenotypically would have looked like their masters. They would have had some Nordic slaves too, so those would have looked a bit different. And of course they would have had some black slaves, but within the general economy of Rome, those would have been numerically minor elements. With that being said, I do disagree with this statement you make.
It's for this reason that people from antiquity were none too picky with whom they captured as slaves.
The Romans were extremely picky when it came to their slaves. If it's a heavy-duty slave, or if it's a gladiator, yeah, anything would do. But if it's house slaves, personal family slaves, slaves that you would travel with, they wanted them Greek. We know from the sources that a Greek slave was valued because they were expected to come educated, they could read, write, do math. And it also was extremely fashionable for Roman families to have expensive Greek slaves. So much so that we know, and we are told as we read the sources, that some Roman families, even though perhaps they bought a slave and he wasn't Greek, they would give him a Greek name so that they could pretend that the slave was Greek, because it made them look more wealthy and successful and educated, so that when they had guests in their homes, the guests would see that the Roman family owner would call his Greek slave with a Greek name, and everyone would be like, oh wow, I'm so impressed. So no, the Romans were very picky. Last but not least, I'd like to spend a word or two on this last final point that you make, whereby You want to show the fact that the Romans didn't really look at the way you looked when it came to emperors, because you show a map and you tell me, you see, Roman emperors came from all of these territories, and so I suppose you're trying to say that the Romans didn't care what you looked like, you could become an emperor.
As another data point regarding the idea of racial discrimination, I'd like to point to this map, which shows how Rome's own emperors hailed from lands across the empire.
That is a little bit of a yes and no statement. Let's remember that regardless of where you were born, as long as it was within the empire, you could become an emperor. Still, you had to have ties with powerful families. And a lot of these areas and territories that you show that are of course outside of Italy don't take into consideration that a lot of these emperors were still connected or even born from Italian families that were living in provincial land. And even those who weren't full Italian, like for example the emperors that were born in North Africa. I know this is gonna upset many people, but let's go out and say it. Septimus Severus was not black. In conclusion, I think it's very important when discussing these matters to have a certain level of critical self-reflection about the way we conduct and construe our own scientific practices and approaches, particularly when dealing with the way people thought, mental patterns, rhetorical devices, and societal factors in the ancient world. And I make this video not only as a way to remind you of that, but also to remind myself of this. It's very difficult to be impartial and to remove our own modern filters, but it is important to do so. Alright, but I hope that you noble ones enjoyed this video. Again, hello to Invicta, and go check him out, subscribe, leave a comment, and say hi from the community of noble ones. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread its wings. Goodbye.